Okay, let's get started. If I can figure out how to start my computer. Here we go. So, for those of you who are interested, I have passed around a book, or part of a book here. It'll probably end up with you at the end, but if you want to pass it around, I don't know if anyone wants to look at it. If you do want to look at the book, take a look at that right there. It's from Dietl and Dietl. I went and I did some research on books to see, because I didn't have a book picked out for this course initially. And the next time I teach the course, which is going to be in the summer, I figured I might as well get a book. So I did some little research, and actually I had a student from a different class actually say, hey, you know, there's this Dietl and Dietl. And I'm like, I love Dietl and Dietl. They're the two authors that make this book. They make, you know, how to program in Java. They make C++. And I'm always saying, Dietl and Dietl, Dietl and Dietl. Because they're cheap. That book I bought actually on Amazon.com, brand new. Bought it myself. It was $29. And this is the current version. I mean, so he's not trying to like make a bundle on his books. Well, because there's a million copies out there. There's a ton of Dietl and Dietl books on the market. But that's not why I bought it. It wasn't the price, although the price was good. The reason why I like it is because it's by example. And I'll post out the URL. Actually, I'll post out the ISBN is what I meant to say for those of you who want to go and research it. But lots of really good examples and lots of information in there, and it's step by step, and it's very, very, very low level. It doesn't assume any knowledge of anything, not even Java programming. So it's really nice because you can learn Java and learn Android and get familiar with everything from ground zero. And he actually goes through a calculator program, a tip calculator, regular calculator, and something else, and a couple of other little things in there. Which is really nice, so, and with pictures and stuff. So, all right. So what you're looking at is part one. I'm going to go through part one and part two of Hello Views today for Android, and just looking at kind of the nitty-gritty details of really focusing on the GUI elements today. So familiarizing yourself with the main types of GUI components. Because last week we went through other types of layouts. I believe a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, we did the layouts. So we've already kind of covered some of the layout information, but the widgets and the menus. We've seen some examples, but this is kind of the textbook slide kind of presentation of the same concepts, but a little bit more information to give you a better understanding of it. So in terms of the linear layout, what we've seen so far, most people use the linear layout by default because that's what the Hello World gives you. When you go and make a default project, you select Android as the project type. It comes back and says, you know, linear layout. I actually prefer the relative layout over the linear layout, actually. Linear layout is going to do everything in a line for you, as you might expect. And in terms of the layout, I'm kind of focus in a little bit here. One of the interesting things and the differences between all of the different layouts and something to point out is that the properties are different. So for a linear layout, you can't set the relative position from one item to another. That's why I like the relative layout, because essentially if I'm using a relative layout, I would take linear layout, replace it with the word relative. This is the opening and closing bracket here for a layout, and then we have another one down here in this particular example. So we have two linear layouts in here, all nested inside of a bigger linear layout. And if you're interested, this URL on the bottom here is developer.android.com, resources, tutorials, views, hello linear layout. That's where this slide set is actually coming from the Android developers. And that's the other thing I recently did is I ran into the Android development open source lecture stuff, and I went, oh, this is really nice actually, because of the examples, obviously. But just to kind of take this a little bit further in terms of what I gave you last time, the layouts themselves provide you with the blanket, or with the, what do you call it, the container for all of the different objects that you're going to put on the layout. So people really get kind of tricky with the types of layouts they pick because it gives you freedom of movement of items. If you just go with linear layout and don't actually experiment at all, then you don't see any of the different types of variations that automate things for you. So instead of struggling, and I've seen this before actually, where people take a linear layout and they put in fake stuff so that they can get the columns to show up correctly. You know, like you put a label in there, take the label off, but you have something in there so something is word wrapping correctly. And what ends up happening is when the screen size changes, so does your layout. So that's one of the problems you have with this basic linear layout. So you don't want to, like, make it work for you by putting in fake items and stuff and trying to mess around with it, because all that person has to do is load it on on a tablet or something with a bigger screen, and your layout's going to be all messed up. Which is the reason why I usually go with the relative layout, because then I can say that this is underneath this, that's underneath this, that's underneath this, and this is to the left or to the right of this, and these are being components and things I'm putting on the layout. So, long story short, has some advantages to it. In terms of the properties that are set, you might see that there's a lot of redundancy. Every time you set the layout, you actually have to set the horizontal position, the vertical position, or the height of it to the orientation. If you don't set these properties, it will use default properties, and the default properties are vertical. This is actually the default properties here: fill parent, vertical, essentially. And then here, this property here changed to horizontal, fill parent with height. And then there's a text box here, and the text box here, this code here on the left is for this code here on the right. And so what we have are text boxes. The first one, it has red in it, and we have red over here. And we have the gravity here set. Gravity is another word for orientation. Is it from the top to the bottom to the middle? Or alignment, actually, I should say. It's probably a better word for it. Why do they call it gravity? I'm really not quite sure. Unless things go fall down, weighted so heavy they fall down to the bottom of the screen. I don't know. But the gravity here is a kind of a newer term, I guess, to use for orientation or for perspective, I guess. But center horizontal is the gravity set. And then we have as an example, this continues with green, blue, yellow, everything else in here. And then on the bottom, we've got row 1, row 2, row 3. Well, those are row 1, row 2, row 3, which is nothing more than text views that are put in, again, another linear layout. But instead of it being horizontal, this linear layout is vertical in terms of its orientation. So we can divide the screen out, like I was showing you before with the nesting, but put different items in the different areas of the screen to essentially create whatever effect, whatever user interface you're trying to achieve by that. So don't be afraid, long story short, don't be afraid to try out the different layouts, because they will make your life easier in terms of what it is you're trying to achieve. Here is the XML file versus the layout preview. If we take a look here, hopefully everybody in this class has seen these screens before. If you haven't, you're way behind and it's time to start to catch up. And what we're looking at, obviously, is just a review of the concept here, that these programmatically set in the HTML file can be done, and it's the same thing that can be done visually by using the graphic GUI editor instead. So, and we click on the tabs to switch between the different views, if you remember that part. Here's my relative layout. If you take a look at the kind of components here, where we've got a label, we've got a text box, we've got a couple of buttons. That's hard to do in a linear layout, believe it or not, because the text box is going to be to the right of the of the label. Everything would be essentially in a line and then word wrapped for the particular line length. And what ends up happening? Are you doing attendance? No. Okay. Is there a TA here yet? You are the TA. You're the TA? Please do attendance. Okay. That's why I asked you if you were doing attendance. Okay, thank you. Then let me talk to you after class as well. Don't leave so quickly. All right. So let's see what we got going on here. This is the code for it, and as I was mentioning before, you can put things. The reason why it's called a relative layout is because every component is in relationship or a relative position to something else that's also out there. So in here we have the text, we have the label itself, and then we have the layout underscore below. So this particular edit text is below this label here. So we're using the labels to say this one's below this one is below that one. This one's to the right margin, this one's to the left margin. This is alignment to the top and the bottom. And essentially what you end up doing is getting a reference book and figuring out, well, what are the properties for this layout? What are the properties for that layout? Just the same way as you do with the components. And then you start basically setting things to make it look right. It's probably the trickiest kind of thing, I would say, for getting the particular look and feel. On the iPhone interface is actually kind of more user-friendly, I think, in terms of the XML interface. Here's another example looking at this is hello table layout. So what we looked at was linear to begin with, relative. Now the table layout is done in a form, and we can kind of see the differences here by the different sections, and sort of a table with rows and columns. Well, we have rows here. We don't really have, we have two columns. We have this column over here. We have this column over here. So if we take a look at the code that's associated to it, actually here, let me zoom in a little bit this way. We see we have layout underscore column equals, you know, the length, the width, or you know, the one. You know, we have one column for a table row, and it sort of looks like HTML a little bit. Another row, you know, where we have the layout column is 1 inch or one. Actually, it's not really an inch; it's a ratio. And this is going to be the save, the open, the save as column, and we basically are essentially defining the rows that are in the table. These tags aren't going to work with the relative layout, aren't going to work with the linear layout either. They're particular to the table layout. And you see at the top we have the table layout. And then we have those basic, this stuff up here is pretty much the same among all of the different layouts. It's going to be basically how you're filling the parent. Are you going to be like the entire window for the parent, or are you going to be inside of another window? So usually it's a fill parent, but it doesn't have to be. You can actually divide the screen out into different sections if you want to, so as we've seen already. We also have this one, which I haven't shown you yet. This one is the tab layout. Now if you want to make your Android application look like an iPhone application, so, well, similar, I should say, you can achieve the tabs where you click on the tabs and it brings it up to different windows. It's another layout option that you have. And one activity per tab as a concept you can probably put together. Create new projects, hello tabs, and if you were doing that, what you would end up doing is following through a different project type. So to kind of you know, give you a little bit of an example of how this is put together, we would essentially create 3 new activities in the project, and then we would be loading the different activities by the different clicks on the different tabs. So in order to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to, you know, create a new project type, right click on hello projects over here. It's still a type activity, and you're going to right click on a new class, source, override implement method to check the on create, because if you remember, the activities themselves that are created by default with a normal project has one on activity in one activity class. If you haven't noticed a pattern yet, when you create a new class, when you create a new project, you get the activity. So if I called it Hello World, I get Hello World activity, and it's the basic class that's going to run the entire project. If you want to use the tab concept, you have multiple activities, and you associate the activities with the tabs in terms of the design. So you have 3 different onCreates if you have 3 different tabs. So you fill in the onCreate method here to basically create the tabs. So in here we have, this is going to be artists, I guess. What is the theme? This is an artist tab. Artists, albums, and songs. It's going to be a music kind of program. So we create a new one. And on here we're going to override and implement methods. We're going to check that box down here to inherit abstract. Well, there used to be a box, but okay, the box has gone away. But all right, it's not in the GUI, but it's in the instructions. So you fill in the onCreate method to say that this is the same thing you're going to get before. This is what you're going to get by default, actually. Quick and dirty by hand, like in Hello World. We can say text view. This is the text view. This text view is this. This is the artist tab, and then we have the first tab, which is the artist tab. And then cut and paste the artist activity into 2 more activities for the album activity and songs activity. So what we're doing is we're creating multiple class files that have one for each one of the activities. And then when we load it, we're going to load all of the different activities per tab, one per tab. You can copy the icons as well. So yeah, right-click, save as, make a RS drawable. Actually, you can put icons on the tabs themselves. Move the icons into the resource drawable directory. And what we have here is just the screenshot showing us saving the tabs, saving the icons, I should say. And then we can associate the IC tab artist XML with the tag selector. So the selector is it's sort of like the menus themselves in terms of which option is going to be selected. The selector itself is going to indicate by an opening and closing XML tag. So the state list drawable object that displays different images for different states of the view is going to have artist, here's artist gray, artist white, which are different images from the resource directory that's being loaded in with drawable. And drawable is actually the name of the particular directory that's out there in the resource subfolder, I should say. And then the state, whether it's selected, whether it's not selected. So we can load the icons per the tabs so that we can get kind of an interesting effect. You can make copies or the XML files for the other two tabs. So what you can do is create the first XML file that has tab number 1 on it, get the activity ready for tab number 1, copy and paste, mix them, otherwise you gotta redo essentially the beginning, redo the tab setup. And then now you have tab number 2, and now you have tab number 3 information that you're going to make copies of from number 1. So you copy the XML file, and you have IC tabs for albums, IC tab for songs, and the first one I believe was for artists. And this is talking about, these are the icons that have been loaded in. The icons were loaded in here and selected by the icons for the selector. So for tab selector number 1, we have a different icon than for number 2, and then for number 3. So, and then taking a look at the full code here, we have as an example here for artists, we have the fill parent, wrap content, which we're probably going to set that for all of them because we're going to want each tab to kind of overwrite what's on the screen for everything else. And then we have a frame layout that's being used. This is the frame here. It's kind of like the same concept of frames it is the same concept as frames in HTML, actually. The frame layout allows us to divide everything out into different portions of the screen, and then we can apply different XML files to different portions of the screen. It's kind of the same concept. But here we have some padding that we're going to set in between this padding is going to end up down here. With the padding essentially in between the different tabs for the vertical orientation. So then the onCreate for the Hello tabs main activity would sort of look like this once you filled it in. So the main activity is the tab activity. It has a tab host. So this is the resource that we're going to create is going to be, we're going to create a resource object, actually call it RES for get resources, which is just the same way as we've been doing before. Actually, it's just using and creating an object for it. So you get the resource object to get the drawables, which are going to be the icons and things, and also the XML files. Well, you're going to need to retrieve the XML files, but you also have to retrieve the images. And then we have the tab host that we're going to create a new object here. That's going to be the activity for tab host. So we're creating a new tab host activity. And then we're going to say, we're going to basically create a tab spec. Call it a spec. So there's going to be a reusable spec for each one of the tabs. The spec's going to load in the information that's going to be particular for each one of the tabs. The correct icon, actually the icons will be loaded first, but the correct page that's associated with each one of the tabs. And then you create an intent to launch the activity for the tabs. So this does not actually eliminate the need for the intents. As we saw intents before, and just refresh your memory on the concept, the Android program, well, the whole program runs as a thread, and only one thread at a time actually runs. And the intents allow us to create a new thread, switch from one thread to the other thread. The old thread goes away, gets garbage collected automatically. The new thread becomes the current activity, this. So when we do the intents, we basically, there's a way of switching between the different threads or the different activities. So if we create 3 different activities, in fact you can do this without using tabs as well, to create 3 different activities, .class files, and then create intents to essentially, or use intents I should say, to switch in between the running of those three. So at one time this is going to run, another time that's going to run. That's how people achieve multi-processing actually, or multi-threading, because we don't actually have a multi-threaded environment. It's one thread at a time that's running. And the other interesting thing I forgot to mention, and just recently kind of decided, maybe I should give you some more foundational stuff, is that the Android actual process that's running is actually running in its own JVM as well. So the Delvic, the runtime environment, each one of those applications that's running isn't actually running in the same, I'm calling it a JVM, but it's a virtual machine emulator / engine that's running. There's a new instance of that actually for each one of those programs, which is how the security is actually enabled. So you can turn things on and off per JVM. So if I turned on it, because usually you see users who use the application, they go, I don't know necessarily want you to turn on the internet. I don't necessarily want you to turn on my Bluetooth. Well, oh my God, it's going to be turned on for everything. Not really. It's just per activity. There's certain features of the phone, however, that run as services. When you turn the service on, it turns it on for everybody. But at the app level, if you're turning it on the app level and it's a security, and I believe we covered, did we cover security last week? It's been such a long week, I can't remember what we covered. So I believe we have covered security in this class, I believe, yeah. Setting permissions in the manifest, Android manifest. Well, if we haven't, that's where they're set. So, long story short, if you change a permission for one app, it does not change any permissions for any other app or any other service or any other utility on the phone, which is a common misperception. People think, don't let it turn anything on. It's like it's only per app. So it runs in its own JVM. The JVM instance stops, terminates, and does its own garbage collection per app. So usually when you have issues with apps that die, they don't terminate properly, they don't shut down properly, that means you still have the JVM running and you still have garbage out there and it thinks it's active but it really isn't active. And what ends up happening is eventually you'll get something that comes up to the screen that says such and such has been killed, or such and such is now a system error, such and such is being removed from memory or something, because it's the main service that's going around checking all the threads that's trying to figure out whether or not that particular program should be running or not, whether it's actually running. And just another side tangent, just because this puts the pieces together for what I'm talking about today. Each one of those apps that's running in its own JVM, that has its own thread management, that uses intents to go transfer back and forth and stuff. We have a main kernel that keeps track of all the JVMs at a higher level, that keeps track of how many processes are running simultaneously and does the memory management for everything, which is doing the pause, the sleep, and monitoring the activities in terms of the app life cycle for each one, everything that's running. That is the main kernel for the phone, for the Android system. And it's kind of like the Windows system that loads all the programs, and it's keeping track of all the programs. And it actually has utilities and features that you can write to. So one program can't actually kill another program. One program can't actually communicate with another program either. Instead, the main kernel that's running is keeping track of everybody. And it's doing outside of the program level. It's keeping track of all of the activities that are going on, which is how you can keep separate databases, separate files, separate privileges, or permissions, separate everything per program. And it's like, how does the system know what's running, what's not? Well, the kernel is taking care of that from an operating system perspective. It's also doing memory management, stuff like that too, which is how you get those random messages that appear that say such and such is not active, would you like to get rid of it? So you probably have not seen any of those random messages unless you've had applications that failed, that were buggy. Everyone has from occasional time installed something that was really buggy. And then you notice, well, it seems to be running my system resources down, or I get these funny messages that appear. So Alright, so back to the slide here. We have the main activity, which is the table activity, the tab activity. It has a tab host that's associated with it as the main object that's being instantiated here. We create an intent to launch an activity from the tab to be reused. And so the intent is going to be a new intent dot set class. Setting the class for this main, this is the current activity. It's setting the class to the artist activity.class, which is going to be the next one. So when this actually happens, when the tab gets pressed and the intent actually works, then the tab host activity is gone. It's completely removed out of memory and stopped, no longer working, which is good. Shut down. And now we have the process that's running the new activity, the artist activity, that's set up. So how do we do that then? How do we send information back and forth between different intents? That's where we have the message passing. And so most people who first try to use intents don't figure out, oh, you have to send the data. You have to send data from one to the other. Because if you don't understand the main concept of what the intent's doing, you go, oh, this thread's running. Now we have this new thread, and we switched over to here. Now I'm going to go back to here. And you figure out how to do the intent, and they go, how come it doesn't know about the first name and the last name of this customer who's using my app? It's because you didn't send it the data. It only knows about the data you're passing back and forth. So it uses a message exchange between the processes. And it's actually handled by the kernel that keeps track of the messages that are going back and forth between the intents that are owned by certain processes. And it knows which message goes to which message. So you can't send a message outside of your particular project space. But you can pass it back and forth with intents, which is kind of interesting. So the trickiest part of using intents, and this would be essentially for this tab program, if someone selects an artist and they want to see, well, what albums do they have, and they click on the albums tab, you got to send the artist name from the artist tab to the album tab. Otherwise, you're not going to get the right artist that shows up for the artist, or album that's going to show up for the artist, or however you're configuring this. So it's kind of interesting that you do have to remember to send the information back and forth. So you initialize the tab spec here for each one of the tabs to add to the tab host. And the spec is going to have all of the artists and the icons and all of the intent information that's associated with each one of the tabs. You add them, you add the spec, and then you do the same thing for all of the tabs. The builder, or the mapping of the resource here, it says tab host set current tab to 2 to select the current tab, which means this is the one that's going to be open. And then you have the activity of when the other tabs are pressed, which is sort of the on-click or the on-touch activity that's going to be set for each one of the tabs. When you run it, it sort of looks like this. In fact, you can take this source code if you wanted to and cut and paste it and put it into a project. And I have to update the bhacker.com website to add these new PowerPoints, which I'm in the process of doing right now, actually. But long story short, you can run this and create this quite simple, actually, by using the source code in the slide set. And basically achieve, we didn't actually create the source code here. It's not creating the pages that are in the tabs or any of the, it's not even sending information between the tabs. You'd have to figure out how to pass the messages back and forth and how to, basically how to create the activities for each one of the tabs. But, yeah, it's the same as the first one. So moving right along to the next kind of an example in terms of user interfaces or GUIs, which is kind of the theme for today. This is the list of the scrollable items in terms of the list view. You'll be amazed how often list views are actually used. Usually you'll have a main layout. You'll put a list view inside of that. And then inside of the list view, you've got another possible layout or another possible list view or another possible table view or something. Because who's going to create just a simple list? So you can actually, this is a simple list right here. But essentially you can create a layout in a separate XML file, take the XML file and load it inside of each one of the list view items. And then what ends up happening is you get, nested list views inside of list views. So here's a list view that has scrollable items. You can set the scroll bar. You can probably can see in here, there's a little line on the right hand side on the screen here. hovering my mouse. This is actually the scroll bar. Not so sophisticated, but if you clicked on it and dragged it down, it would go to the bottom. Or if you just went down with the arrow, or you just went like this with your finger, it would actually scroll down. So what you're looking at here is an application. It will inherit from list activity rather than activity. So as a project type, you can actually use the wizards to create a list view activity, which is the same thing that you actually do in the iPhone SDK. Works the same way, actually. The project type turns out giving you the template. You don't actually have to do that. You can take and create another class and put it inside any project, or take the main activity and turn it into a list activity. You just inherit from list activity instead of extending activity. And then you create what's called a list XML interface, and you put it inside the resource directory, and usually inside a layout. Whereas basically we're going to see main.xml, then you're going to see list item.xml. So it's layout for each one of the items. So you stick the list items inside of the list view, and then you've got the concept down. So in terms of overriding the onCreate method to create a list view abstraction, this is what we're looking at. Show you a little bit, because now you should now at this point you should be able to understand the source code. You should essentially have written a couple projects already at this point. Although you do have another month left until May 1st to turn in all the projects for this class, but you should have at least gotten one or two of them maybe out of the way at this point. So we all know that the average, if I were to ask you on a midterm or a final exam, so what's the average, what class do we inherit from normally when we create a default project? Activity? What is the main, hello world running? It's running an activity. So I'll review before the final, obviously, some of the different terminology. But what is activity then? It's a form of an object that's coming from another object that's coming from another object. It's kind of like when you write Java programs and you want to write an applet. What are you extending from? You're extending from applet. Or, if you're going to write an application, you're just extending from object, and in Java there's no object, so you just leave it off. You just write hello world, and that's my name of my class. So here we're extending from list activity here instead of activity, which extends, as we know, as inheritance, I hope at this point. So hello list, called when the activity is first created. It's just a subclass of activity. It's just very similar, except for it's going to give us this interface instead of one activity. It gives us slightly different methods as well that we can call on it to get list items and things. So we set up the list for this activity here with this layout and this content. And the content here is going to be a bunch of countries. So here we know on the create we're calling super on create. We're going back to the main guy here, the list activity. From inheritance, we're running that on create, and then we're going to set what's called set a list adapter. Now, the list adapter is inherited as part of the list activity functionality that we're getting, which is why we're inheriting from list activity. The list adapter is going to be an array of items that are going to be stored in the list view, and we actually, believe it or not, why didn't they call it they call it an array adapter, but why didn't they call it an array out here? I don't know. Because it really is just an elaborate array. Each one of the list items has an index associated with it, 0, 1, 2, 3, just like an array. So this is an array, if you think about it. And so at any one moment of time, it's a dynamic array. It can actually grow. At any one moment of time, it might have 5 items, 3 items, and we get at it through array indexes. So here we're setting a filtering for the keyboard on the list view. The list view itself, the filter is essentially to capture clicks and things and capture touches on the list items so that we can say if the user selects item number 1, do this, item number 2, do that. And in the array, actually, we have the item number, we have the label that's on the list item perhaps, maybe we have an icon. We can store any number of data associated with that list item. And we can use that essentially, which means you can dynamically create this. As an example of a primitive kind of way of doing something, you could run a query. Actually, basically do an internet search, run a query on the internet information, populate a list view with information you don't know what it's going to be, set the titles and stuff, and then on the click of a particular item, grab the title and treat it appropriately. Open it up. Let's say some of it's Word files, some of it's PDF files or something. You know, open it up with the correct viewer, do something with it. So we set the context filter enabled. Basically, it says turn it on, make it so we can set the context of which item was being selected. And then we set this here. And I believe I talked about this last time, which was the listener. So on a list view, we have a list, and we have an on item click listener that's we're attaching to the list view, which is the same thing we're doing for button presses. It's just the same thing we're doing for you know, entry into an edit box or in a label or anything that any item actually in the GUI can have a listener associated with it. And in the Android environment, we actually have to set the listeners if we want it to actually capture the event. If we don't set the listener, we get no event, nothing happens. So in here, we're just going to set a toast message to appear on the screen. So on click item, on an item click, you know, when it's click, show a toast with the text view text, whatever's in the text view, put on the screen. So toast.makeText, and then here we're going to get the text from the view, whichever item, the text view actually was from the view, and then add it to the toast. So which is just nothing more than a little message that appears on the screen. And if we run it, it looks like this. In the text view, if it had these two items and we pressed on Venezuela, we'd see Venezuela out here, actually. This is interesting. We're only getting the first two items. Well, I didn't read through the code all the way, but we're only getting part of the information that's appearing on the screen. So that is a run through on the source code that's associated with and the control of the particular GUI item. The other item that's actually kind of interesting and I haven't covered yet in the course is the state picker, which is interesting. You can use this for an alarm clock. You could use this for a GUI item inside of your program to pick a date of some sort. We also have a calendar picker, so we could actually pull up a calendar widget and pick a day off of a calendar, given a year and a month or something. So the date picker will display a dialog box allowing you to change the date. Here's the date. Here, well, what's it going to change the date of? Something that's associated probably with a text box or a label that's in your application. So, you know, maybe you're going to set a reminder for yourself or something like that. So it looks like a primitive iPhone, actually, picker. So it's a little different. It's a little different style, but it's basically uses the same similar type of functionality, except for here we're putting a set and a cancel button on the bottom of it. And we take a look at the source code that's associated with this particular GUI item. What we've got here is the linear layout. We only have one item. Actually, we have two items on here. No, we only have two items. We have a label up here, which is actually just the app name. It's actually not really a label. It's a title bar. We have one item on here. It's a button. Here it says change the date. You can see it in the background there. Here's your button here. It says change the date on it here. That's bringing up, and we're going to call it a pick date because we'll do an on-click listener to pick the date. You know, the date picker will have to display the date. So here we have another one where we're setting the Android ID with nothing, essentially. So if we look at the onCreate for this particular program, if we were to create it, we would have a capture of our view element. That's important because we need to know that we've actually, had somebody click on something. So we go out and we get the items from the GUI, same thing as before. And here we're using a date display from the resource file, which is a text view, which is essentially what's on our XML screen after we've inflated it. We're saying we're using main.xml, so we put all these items on main.xml. We're going to create a new button element inside of the source code, call it mPickDate, which is a button type that's going to hold the information. We're going to add the listener. And kind of as a way of giving you a best practice, again, what we're looking at is essentially the button capturing, or getting the button information, and then the button click listener pretty much associated with themselves, but one right after the other. So a lot of people like to put the listeners on the bottom of the source code. Some people like to put the listeners intermixed inside. It's actually easier, I believe, to do it this way, only because you have the element and then you have the listener that are together. So you don't have to worry about, well, what do we call that element? You know, what did I call it? I'm going to put a listener on it. So it's easier to find the code if it's together, just as a practice. So this code here is adding the set-on-click listener to the button itself using, and here we're just going to show the dialog, and to show the dialog, I believe, I can't remember if I showed you dialogs. I think I did actually. I showed you pop-up menus and dialogs. If not, I have a few more examples to give you as well. But it's going to use the date dialog ID as essentially a parameter for show dialog for the type of dialog box, which is going to give you a date picker, essentially, which is the date dialog. And then get to current date. Here we're just going to go to the calendar, make a calendar instance of a calendar object. We're going to call it calendar C. And we're going to have a month, a day, and a year that we're going to get in terms of the C get date for get calendar year, calendar month. And then display the current date that somebody is essentially. So the method is below, way below here is the update date. Here it is here actually. So to display the date, what you're doing is essentially creating a string and you're putting the information from the date object, the month, day, and the year, adding it to the string and displaying the string, probably on a label on box. So I believe this is either a text box or a label. I believe it's a text box, but appending the information essentially with the proper symbol that you're going to put in between all the different elements of the information. And in this particular case, it's a line. So you could use a colon or something if you wanted to. And then we have the onDate set listener. So we have the set listener for the button, and then when we have used the onDate, when the dialog comes up, shows us the date, we have a listener that captures whatever changed. So we probably set it to the current date. Actually, we did. The user's probably going to select something else. So there's a separate listener for that, as you would probably expect. So here is received when the user actually sets the information in the dialog. And so we create a new object essentially where we have an onDate set method that's running, and onDate set methods from the listener onDate set listener that's listening. So on a set, on a change, we're going to keep track of the year, the month, and the day that's associated with it, and we're going to update the display. So one thing to keep in mind, and you probably, hopefully, are getting this idea from the point being iterated over and over again, but each one of the listeners is code that basically runs when the item is selected, and if the item's not selected, the code's not going to run. So, which is kind of interesting because on some code you'll see on click, or you'll see on touch, or on change, on reset, and it's basically at that point what you end up doing is you're getting a reference book, and looking at it and going, well, on this particular GUI item, what happens to it? Somebody clicks it, somebody touches it, somebody changes it. So, and then you figure out, well, what method am I going to run? What am I listener am I going to put on this? For which event am I going to look for? Because what's going to end up happening is you're going to put it all together, and you're going to go, and it doesn't work. I've been clicking on this forever, and it's not going to open up. That's because you got the wrong click listener. You got a different listener listening for something else, and that event hasn't occurred yet. So the onCreate dialog, which is actually an event as well, dialog create. So we have onCreate dialog. In this particular event, we're going to switch the dialog, and we're going to switch it for different cases that might exist. And it might be, have different options on the dialog, different boxes or something. So in this particular case, when it's on a dialog, date dialog ID, which is the dialog ID that we sent it here, when we said show dialog, date dialog ID, so in our update display, say, what do we got here? On our create dialog for our show dialog that we're going to run, we're going to create this, we're going to return a date picker dialog. And the date picker dialog is going to be a new instance, essentially, that's going to be returned. Didn't actually give it a name. We don't really have to. If we're just going to use it to capture the information, if we're not going to use it again, we don't really have to give it a reference object, but we could if we wanted to. But here we're just saying return new date picker, or date picker dialog, and return it to this, which is the current object, current thread that's running, as I mentioned before. Date listener, the year, the month, the date that's associated with that particular new instance that was created. So maybe run it looks like this. Just click on this change date and the little dialog comes back up. This is not today's date, but you can kind of get the idea, hopefully. So that was part one of views, and what I'm covering today is the concept of views. Don't worry, we're not going to go too far. I'm not going to keep you too late. We have part two I want to cover today as well. Part two is only 14 slides, so that's not too bad. But it keeps the pieces together, at least it makes some consistency among the different topics for each day. So we'll take this a little bit further. So we got a form here. So hello form stuff. So now we have a custom buttons, edit text. We have checkboxes, radio boxes, toggles, toggle buttons, rating bars. Same kind of GUI items that you might be familiar with other development IDEs, usually Visual Studio's got kind of the same labeling, which is kind of interesting because the labeling is pretty much the same. A button's a button, except for we have image buttons and we have buttons. It's just different types of buttons. So, custom buttons, take a look at that. So on a button itself, we've got different types of buttons that we can create in terms of elements on a selector here. So I believe there's a list box on the previous. Yeah, there's a list box up here where we've got an image, a text box, a button down here, stars. This is all actually in a list box, Listview. So on a button itself, we have the button, and the button has an ID associated with it because we have to keep track of the button inside of the source code. When we unfold it, inflate it, we get all of the information out of the button. We can have the background, the padding. This is just a regular old button. If this were an image button, then we would have a property here to set the background image. It's the image basic tag. And all of it's coming from the resource directory, so we would load the image in there, and we attach it to the button. And then we have another get the button here. So inside of the source code itself, inside of the XML code, we're defining the element. Inside of the source code, we're inflating it, getting the item, and using it, essentially. And so we can click here, final button. Button is going to be this button from the ID button. Here's the ID button that came from the XML code. And we're setting an on-click listener, and the on-click listener is going to perform a task, and the task is going to send a toast message to the screen that's going to say bebop on it, essentially when the button is clicked. So very minimal functionality, because this is like hello world buttons. For the edit text, and the edit text here is going to be this box that opens up right here, where we can edit text, put text in there, load it back up. In an edit text, we don't have too many properties that we can set on here. Instead, we're going to set an ID, and the ID is going to be what we're going to call it inside of the code. And inside of the code, we're going to say edit text, find it, the view by the ID, and then we're going to use the edit text ID here. And then we have a set on-click listener, same kind of thing we said before for the button. So we could also set for the text edit different listeners. We could set it on text change, on click, on delete, on if it's empty kind of listeners. So if the event is a key down on the enter button, then we're going to set this one. Otherwise, if the action is a key action down, we're going to set that. Wait a minute, this is the edit text listener. What do I have? It should be on the text edit box, actually, not the button. So in any case, it's going to pop up a text message, a toast message, excuse me, that says you clicked in the item, essentially. That's what it's going to end up doing. You can actually have a key down, a key up, as the same way as a button press down, a button press up, a release. So you can have a long click, like a long touch. That's kind of action associated with it as well. So here's our checkbox kind of example. On the checkbox, we have a check it out that's written on here, item number 3. I guess the image, the image for item number 1 is up here. So, and it's just, there's really nothing on an image. Although you can set a event to occur on an image if you wanted to. You can put a listener on an image. So you pressed an image, and it was like the icon, let's say for the company. It would open up the company website or something. just like you would do, let's say, in an HTML page. Here's a checkbox. Checkbox is going to be finding the checkbox by the ID that's associated with it and set an on-click listener, and the on-click listener is going to look at perform actions on clicks of the text box depending upon what was checked. So if you checked I like this, I like that, it'll keep track of what was selected. And in this particular example, is doing nothing more than putting a toast message up with, hey, you selected this, or you selected that. The radio button is normally a multiple select, which it is usually in other programming languages as well. Here we have what's called a radio group. In the radio group, we can have it select one and deselect another, or we could have multiples. Actually, you can set multiples if you wanted to by creating multiple multiple checkboxes as well. But the radios are generally looking at swapping between groups. So here we have a radio group tag that's created inside the radio group. We've got two. We've got a red and we've got a blue radio option that's set. So on the on-click listener, we can do a radio listener. So here we have a radio listener, on-click radio listener, and it's an on-click listener. And then we have an on-click listener here, and we have an on-click listener here. So hopefully you're getting the idea. It's all on-click. On-click listener. So on-click listener ends up being the de facto standard in terms of the activity that a user is doing with the interface. So here we have a radio button. It's going to be called RB. Get the buttons here from the view, and it's going to pop up a little message that says you selected red, you selected blue, essentially, because on here, after you've set the listener, you're going to get which option it was that was actually selected in terms of the components that are visible. We have the toggle button as well, and the toggle button is underneath the red and the green on this display here. Here's the toggle button. So we have the red and the blue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say green. This is the toggle button here, and this is, if you can't read it, it says vibrate off. You switch it, it says vibrate on. Turn the lights off, turn the lights on. It's called a toggle button. You create the toggle button item, you give it an ID, you call it inside of the code, just the same way as you call all the other buttons, but this one's actually meant to actually toggle something. So you press it, and it automatically switches the label for you. So here we have a toggle, and on the toggle we're going to set the on-click listener, and the on-click listener, again, this is kind of, after I go through a couple of these, the on-click listener looks all the same after a while. So if the button is checked or if it's not checked, do something different. So on each one of the toggles, if it was toggled, do something. So it sets up what it's going to do. It's going to set up a little I'm checked or I'm not checked, depending upon which option actually occurred. So you have a default option. In this particular case, it's vibrate on. When you click it, you've checked it. It says vibrate off, so which gives you that on or off, or kind of checked or unchecked type of behavior. Then we have what's called a rating bar. The rating bar, we actually saw this in the iPhone class if you're taking that class, but it's these stars that are on the bottom of the screen here. It fills in. You can actually get half of a star to fill in, 3/4 of a star. So the rating is called a rating. The rating bar, you set it up here, and you say, how many stars do I want? You put in 5 stars. So don't do this on your, don't reinvent the wheel. Use the GUI objects that are available to you. Put a little rating in here, and then you can set the step size. Here's going to be whole stars, 1. So you can go half stars every time someone selects something. 1/4 stars. So hopefully you'll do 1s, perhaps. So again, this is kind of trivial. We've got the rating bar here. This object that we're going to create, we're going to inflate the UI, pull the object out, set it on, click on rate, set on rate bar change listener. That's a mouthful. Which is essentially another form of it's inherited from on click listener, but this is on an on rating bar change. So on rating bar change, we're going to print in a little message out to the screen. Not going to do very much with it. Say, hey, there's a new rating, and here's the new rating. So you can cut and paste this code, put it in projects, and basically play around with these particular GUI components and see what happens. I believe we saw the Webview in this class already, but programmatically to show you the code for it, making the web view and a view, viewing web pages, what we do is we drag and drop and we put a component on, we call it a web view. And the web view itself can be a component that's going to be inside, let's say for example main.xml. If we were going to build this, this is nothing more than a web view. So it sounds like a pretty sophisticated application. You can create hello world, basically draw, actually just do it programmatically, stick a web view on there, make it fill up the parent, and you have this application here, which isn't too bad. Actually, you can go one step further and set a default URL for it. Have it load WebView, have it load something, load a URL, and it would actually set something, which is what this is doing. This loads Google essentially. But the component itself, the Gui component, is set by the ID WebView, and it's filling the parent. And then we have WebView my WebView, which is going to be an instance of a WebView object. So we can take WebView and we can actually modify it. So on create, we're going to set the super on create, say this particular instance state, set the view, which is basically just our default information that we always see in each one of the on creates. Set the context view to main, we'll see that as well. But down here is the interesting part, or the same part, which is kind of interesting because what I haven't shown you yet are all the parameters that are associated with WebView. So you can enable a lot of stuff on web views. By default, nothing is enabled. So what you can do is create, and I don't believe the slide set's going to do it, but you can create an on download file event. You can create the use of CSS style sheets. This particular example is showing you JavaScript. So set JavaScript enabled to true in this particular case here, and this is from the get settings. You can set the URL here, load URL. That's obviously, that's probably definitely a must to set something. Otherwise, you're going to get a blank page. You're not going to get any web view. It's going to be stuck on nothing. But again, this is why you get those reference books, because now you can go and look up WebView and you can see all the different parameters that you're going to see. In fact, I don't think the book, the Deedle and Deedle book's got any reference stuff. The best stuff you find is usually on the internet, because what ends up happening is the APIs keep changing on you. And as the APIs change, well, the WebView features kind of change a little bit. And now you have a back button and a forward button and a home button automatically built in. Now you have this, now you have that. Well, some of the older APIs didn't really have JavaScript, but now they have JavaScript. Some of them didn't have support for CSS or loading in CSS pages and stuff, style sheets and things. So imagine everything you do in web programming you can do on the Android. So here's setting the title bar. So here in the Android permissions, manifest, you're going to set the permissions, and you have to use the internet for a web view. So if you don't set this, you don't get an error at all, which is kind of maybe in the future APIs we'll see more error checking, more debugging. Because it wouldn't be nice if you ran your WebView application and it said, permissions aren't set for the internet. Oh, then you'd go back and set permissions, right? But no, it doesn't do that. Instead, nothing will happen. It won't actually load the web page. But it'll look like it's working just fine. It just doesn't load the web page, because it doesn't have the permission to load the web page. So if you think about it, the functionality is kind of good, only because what happens when your application gets deported, it's deployed and it's on your Android device, do you really want it to give you messages like, hey, you didn't load it in your WebView? That's like for the programmer. So when you run it, it's definitely not from a programmer's perspective, it's from the user's perspective in terms of the user interface. Okay, so here we have to set the activity named Hello Web View, and we have the string for the app name, and we have the theme. Or we're going to say anything with no title bar. We could put a title bar on the web view. We could put a URL bar on the web view. We can put all sorts of things, depending upon what version of the API you're working with. You're going to get different features that show up on the web view. And here it is. Here, this says, I believe, no title bar. Yeah, no title bar. So it looks like this. And that's probably easier than Hello World, actually. Almost as easy as Hello World, I would say. Generating API keys, as we've seen already, I'm not gonna go through this, but there's a map view that's coming up, and on the map view object, I went through this already, I believe. I showed you guys how to create the keys. We looked at a different map view example, but you'll end up getting a key as we've seen before, and you end up putting this in the GUI element because we have the default. That's a web view. oops, we also, didn't mean to do that, hold on one second. We have the default web view, which comes in very handy, and then we also have what's called a map view. A map view is just similar, it's inherited from Webview, except for it's used to store a map. So we have gone through this example, but just to reiterate the point, where we're putting that app key is actually in the GUI component. So we're putting it in the map view. Just the same way as we tell the web view to load a URL, we're sending it here for my web view, which is an instance of, well, it's the object that we're getting or inflating from the r.id web view that we created on this XML interface that's giving us the control of the interface. But in here, essentially, the point to bring home is the fact that this map view is taking the key. So the key actually works with the permissions. You have to set the permissions properly to actually use the key, and the key is actually done over the internet. So the map view is nothing more than a web view with map features added onto it. And one of the map features, well, the built-in methods to find location, to go to a location, to scroll in and out, to zoom, stuff like that. And to take on a key as a parameter, API key. So when the web view, map view loads, the web view part loads up, sends the map key to Google and says, are you allowed to use the map view? Okay, you are. Here you go. Is your device safe? Why did they do that? I don't know. Maybe it's to keep it from having bots out there using the map view tool. I don't know. It has to be per device. Each device has its own, or each computer API version has its own API key. It's associated with it, which is interesting. And it's actually a calculation of your computer hardware and the SDK that you've got loaded. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, that's what I wanted to cover for today. So, as promised, I will, even though I got a late start, I will let you out on time at least. So, questions, comments, or concerns? You guys are working on assignments, I hope. Everything is due on May 1st. Okay. For the iPhone class too, yeah. For all classes. Actually, I believe the last day of the term is, what, May 2nd or 3rd? I believe. Coming up soon, actually, let me take a few minutes here to take a look at the calendar. I have a few minutes. Some of you don't have to leave for another 2 minutes or so. So Tuesday, May 1st is when all the assignments are due. We have one class meeting next week. The following class week on the 16th, so not next week, but the following week. And next week I'm going to do a hodgepodge of a bunch of stuff that I've left out. But what I'm really going to do on the 16th is tell you everything you really need to know for the final. And give you some sample kind of questions and stuff. Like, what do I need to focus on? Because what we essentially did is in the last 15 weeks or so covered an entire API. It's a lot of information. Didn't hit everything in a lot of detail. Hit some stuff in more detail than other stuff. You basically got an introductory exposure to Android in general. So what I'm going to do is kind of narrow down your studies for you. You will not have to, obviously, you will not have to write any source code or anything for the final. It'll probably be multiple choice format, probably be super easy. But in order to ace it, you pretty much have to know features of Android. And, as an example before, what's the default project type? What is it inheriting from? What can you inherit from? Is a good question as well. But I'll come up with a bunch of different sample questions for you. So it's not next week, which is the 9th. It's the following week, which is the 16th. And that's an important class to show up for, just so you know what's on the final. And the final exam will be on the 23rd. Or you may take it on the 25th if you want to. It's your option. Usually, you can take Wednesday or Monday or Wednesday, which are the 2 days I'm here. You can take either way. Now, do we have any questions outside of... Don't ask me what's on the final. I don't know yet. I'm in the process of writing it up. So, and the final that someone's taking right now is going to be a different final. It's harder, actually. I have a student taking a final right now. But actually, not for this class. It's taking for a different class. It'll be a different one, because that one's already been out. It's been let out. So, okay, thank you. See you next week. That means it does show up next week.